Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Rutherford Hayes, and the focus is a good man with a tarnished legacy. The year is 1881. It's coming to the end of the first term for Rutherford Hayes, and he made it clear there would be no second term. He had made a one-term pledge. He was going to stick with it. He was not going to run for re-election. He threw his support behind his Treasury Secretary, John Sherman, who he said, "To no one am I so much indebted for the career in public life, which is now closed, as I am to you. I want you to know that I know and appreciate this fact." He was going to support Sherman for the presidency, but there were others in the race. James Blaine, that Hayes had beaten out 4 years before, he was in the mix, as was Ulysses Grant. Grant was being pushed by Roscoe Conkling, who had had so much difficulty with Hayes over the last couple of years. Conkling wanted power back. He thought he could get it with Grant. Grant had been away for a couple of years on a world tour after his 2 terms as president. He was back. He was still popular. Maybe a 3rd term in the White House for Ulysses Grant. Well, they all gathered in Chicago for the convention in June of 1880. And for a long time, it was deadlocked. You had Blaine and Grant out front, Sherman kind of a distant third, ballot after ballot, nobody was changing. Finally, on the 35th ballot, a new name was thrown into the mix, trying to find some way to break the logjam. That name was the Ohio Congressman James Garfield. Now, Garfield jumped out of his seat and said, "No, don't vote for me." Garfield had put Sherman's name into nomination. He was at the convention specifically to support Sherman. He thought if anybody voted for him, it would be a stain on his own reputation. But the delegates didn't care. They shouted him down, and within 2 more ballots, James Garfield was the Republican nominee for president. Now, Rutherford Hayes was happy to support Garfield, another fellow Ohioan, but he was not going to get involved in this election. In fact, he went on a trip. He got as far away as possible, traveled a couple of thousand miles all to the way to the West Coast, didn't come back until Election Day when he got home to Spiegel Grove in Ohio, his home, where he voted for Garfield, and sure enough, Garfield won the race, beat the Democrat Winfield Hancock to become the 20th president. Hayes was happy to escort Garfield on Inauguration Day from the White House to the Capitol for the transfer of power. In fact, he even stuck around for the parade. Not a lot of outgoing presidents did that, but he was on very good terms with Garfield. He enjoyed that moment. And then it was retirement time. Heading back home to Ohio, to Spiegel Grove, he was financially set, never had to work again, but he wasn't exactly going to disappear either. He still had causes that he cared about. Number 1 on the list was education. Education for the poor, education for blacks. Hayes proclaimed himself to be a looker-on except as to education. On that, I am persistent. In and out of season, before all sorts of audiences, and he would persist in that, frankly, to the day he died. He joined the lobbying, sort of unofficial lobbying of Congress to provide more federal funds and subsidies for universal education. Still leave the decisions about things like curriculum to the locals, but provide some funds to help out have more people get this kind of universal education. He also became the president of the Peabody Education Fund, and he was very active with the Slater Fund. John Slater had given $1 million of his own money to create a fund specifically for the education of blacks, and Hayes was a big part of this in terms of raising money and also putting it to good use. One of the people who benefited was the civil rights leader, W.E.B. Du Bois. He said that shortly after Hayes' death, "I am especially grateful to the memory of him, your late head," talking about Hayes, "through whose initiative my case was brought before you, and whose tireless energy and single-heartedness for the interests of my race God has at last crowned." He was very grateful for the work of Rutherford Hayes, who again, at the national, local, state levels, he was pushing for education reform, more access to education until the day he died. He had some other causes that he cared about. Prison reform, better treatment, better education programs in prisons, also to help prepare convicts for re-entry into society. He would lend his time and philanthropy in that direction. He was also concerned about the rising income inequality that was going on in this period of the country called the Gilded Age, where a small number of very powerful individuals and companies were kind of running the whole economy. According to Hayes, the government of the people, by the people, and for the people had become a government of corporations, by corporations, and for corporations. In this case, he had no quick answers. He was concerned about it, but this would continue to be a problem and frankly wouldn't be addressed for another couple of decades when the progressive movement finally started to kick in. Veterans causes was the other area that also got a lot of attention and was a real sweet spot for Hayes. The war, the 4 years in the war, had been the best of his life. He had said it many, many times. He never missed a reunion of the Ohio 23rd. He was active in other veterans organizations like the Military Order of the Loyal Legion, the Society of the Army of West Virginia, the Grand Army of the Republic. He was always answering the call pretty much when anybody needed it. The veterans issues were something near and dear to his heart, and if he could give of his time, raise money, he was happy to do so. Well, eventually age started catching up to them. Now, Lucy Hayes, his wife, was actually 9 years his junior, but she was the first to pass. At only 57 years old, she suffered a stroke in June of 1889, and she would never recover from that. Marriage to Lucy Hayes was basically perfection as far as Rutherford Hayes was concerned. It was central to his entire existence. He never stopped mourning for the loss of his wife, as he said that, "I think of her as the golden rule incarnate." Mrs. Hayes was personally known and loved by more people than any other woman in the world. He believed this. It was the central element of his entire being. And again, he was not quite the same after her passing. He was 66 at the time, and he also started to slow down physically. His hair and beard had long turned white, and his children started traveling with him just to be there in case he needed them. Fanny, his daughter primarily, but also his son Webb, also took tours with Hayes when he was traveling. And one day in 1893, they got stopped at the Cleveland Railroad Station, where Hayes felt a sudden chill and had some chest pains. And Webb was traveling with him, and he wanted him to go see a local doctor. And Hayes said no. He knew the end was near. He said to his son, "I would rather die in Spiegel Grove than live anywhere else." He wanted to go home. 3 days later, he told his doctor, "I am not unhappy. My life is an exceptionally happy one." He added, "I know that I am going where Lucy is," and he did die later that day, January 17th of 1893. Rutherford Hayes was a good man. He was a really good man, kind-hearted, generous, a loving husband and father, kind of a rare politician who would have very few political enemies, really, until he took on the bosses of politics with his position on civil service reform. But he could see the good in everyone. He enjoyed people. They liked him, volunteered for many causes, and he was a true leader. Particularly in the war, men in battle, they put their lives on the line for him. He was one of the good colonels, as he talked about, in the trenches with his men. He served the entire war. He was wounded 4 times. He was everything that the North needed to rally these citizen soldiers to fight for a cause that they believed in. His presidency, pretty uneventful. He had a relatively small agenda. He didn't accomplish all that much. To his credit, he did put civil service reform very much front and center. He took on the biggest boss. He won a particular battle with him. It didn't end the corruption associated with patronage. That would go on for his successors to take care of. But probably his most significant action as president on the positive side was at least putting a dent in the area of civil service reform. But frankly, none of this can overcome the decision he made even before he entered the White House. That compromise of 1877 that was made on his behalf, he never repudiated it. In fact, he gave every indication that it was made in the spirit in which he would support it, and his actions he did support. Within a month of taking office, he ended Reconstruction, he removed the troops, federal troops from the South, and what was the result? It was devastating for the black community in the South, as they fundamentally lost the right to vote. They became second-class citizens. Now, Rutherford Hayes would never agree that he abandoned Southern blacks. He felt he had the commitment of those Southern leaders to make good and protect the rights of blacks. But he said, and he claimed that his Southern policy did its work. Not instantly, but slowly and surely, the anticipated progress is still going. Well, this naive comment, this naive thought that things were suddenly going to get better in the South was simply off-base. He believed that the Southern leaders would come around, and frankly, they did not. It was another 87 years until the Civil Rights Act came along, and that was being imposed by the federal government, certainly not by the likes of the Southerners willingly giving up some of the rights from blacks that they had taken away. This cannot be divorced from the legacy of Rutherford Hayes. Other presidents certainly complicit in this, as many of them followed him and didn't do anything about this situation for decades upon decades. But Hayes was the man in the chair. He made this decision. He consciously pulled out those troops, naively thinking that the Southerners would live up to their words, that they would provide protections of rights to the blacks. The fact is that Rutherford Hayes made one of the most catastrophic, ruinous decisions in the history of the American presidency, certainly a tarnish to his legacy. That's Rutherford Hayes, a good man with a tarnished legacy from the life of Rutherford Hayes. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.